Hi there, everyone. My name is Rich Goddard at VR Intelligence, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar in association with YouGov, where we'll be drilling down on the current state of consumer adoption in virtual reality. We've got an excellent lineup of industry thought leaders joining us today, who I'll introduce you to in a second. But as well as their views, we'll also be focusing on the views of consumers to get an understanding of their feelings about VR, their habits and perceptions, to assess these opportunities and challenges from a consumer perspective. So to do that, we've partnered with YouGov, one of the world's leading international market research and data analytics companies, which interviews 3,000 consumers each quarter as part of its virtual reality syndicated tracking survey. In a second, I'll be handing over to Tom Fuller, who's a research director at YouGov. He'll be running through the research findings, and he'll be joined by 3 industry experts from Survios, Intel, and Merge VR, who'll be giving their views on what this all means for the industry and how they'll be approaching the future of consumer VR. Before I hand over to Tom, just a quick note just to let you know that this webinar is being produced in conjunction with VRX 2017, the B2B event for senior level professionals in VR, AR, and immersive tech, taking place in San Francisco this December 7th and 8th. We'll send you through some more information after the webinar and hope to see you all there. So thanks again for tuning in, and I'll now hand you over to Tom Fuller from YouGov.
Well, thank you, Richard. I appreciate it. Glad to be here and glad to be talking to you all. Just to get this thing started, what I think I'll do is talk a little bit about myself and give you a 2-second pitch on YouGov, and then ask the panelists to introduce themselves. Again, as Richard said, my name is Tom Fuller, and I work at YouGov in our Portland office, where we focus on things like interactive gaming technology, and more recently, things like wearables, and now, of course, virtual reality. We've been following this stuff for a long time. We love it, and we're passionate about it. I actually did a stint in the VR industry way back about 15 years ago, and that's probably enough out of me for a second here. Let's see if we can get the panel to tell us a little bit about themselves and the organizations that they're with. Ben, do you want to start talking about you and Survios? Hello, Ben. Okay, we'll catch up with Ben in just a second. Let's move on to Jeremy. Jeremy, would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself and Merge VR?
Yeah, sure. So Merge VR, if you haven't heard of us, we're building a number of really cool products for kids that focus on virtual and augmented reality. So we're really looking at how we can bring these really new, interesting, and cutting-edge technologies and put them in kids' products that kids are going to love. Part of what I do at Merge is oversee really customer experience, I guess you could say, and so I do a lot of leading of our software teams, building experiences on our latest product, the Cube, which is the Merge Cube. It's this augmented reality device that kids can use to play games and have all kinds of different crazy, wild experiences. It's a little hard to describe without seeing a video of it. So I lead a lot of that, but then also touch a lot on marketing and branding and stuff like that. Merge is a very design-focused company, and so design leads everything that we do. So kind of touching everything from software to all these other areas as well.
That sounds really interesting. Ben, are you back online?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, indeed.
So Survios is a venture-backed game development studio focused exclusively on VR. We develop only for the high-end 6-stop units on the market, which includes the HTC Vive, Oculus Rift, and PSVR, as well as some of the other sort of upcoming devices that are going to be joining the market. Our first game that we released is called Raw Data, which reached the #1 slot on Steam for all games, which is a sort of a benchmark for us that we're going to continue to try to hit going forward. And we have a second game called Sprint Vector, which is redefining most people's constraints around what's possible around locomotion in VR. Super pleased to be here and excited to talk about what the future is.
Terrific, thanks a lot. Hey Lisa, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and the organization that you represent?
Good morning, everyone. This is Lisa Watts with Intel Corporation. I'm very happy to be here. My particular role at Intel is I'm the global VR marketing lead. For me personally, that's an interesting role because I actually come from the engineering and product side of the business, and to be able to move into the marketing side of the business that I have for the last few years has been very thrilling, getting me closer to the customers. One of the key things that Intel is most passionate about is that when it comes to the entire pipeline of VR, there's really no better company out in the marketplace to deliver the solutions end to end. And as we see the market continue to grow, we get more and more excited, not only about some of the content that's coming out of there. You know, you just heard Ben talk about the work at Servios, and they've been a great partner of ours in pushing the boundaries on premium VR. You know, we see a huge opportunity to continue to partner with the ecosystem as a whole, and really paying off everything we think VR can be. So pleased to be here and looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Lisa, and thank you also, Ben and Jeremy. The title of my presentation is Crossroads because I'm going to try and make the case that VR is at a crossroads based on the information that the general consumers and VR owners have given us over the past year. And in fact, this is going to be an exercise in tough love for the first few minutes of the presentation. I hope you'll take it in the spirit of constructive criticism. I love VR and I want to see it succeed, but at times I'm wondering if this might be the last or maybe the next to last year that we discuss virtual reality as a standalone sector. One of the questions that is in the back of my mind, and I hope that the panel can address later, is whether augmented or merged reality is going to vacuum up virtual reality on the way to glory in a related sector. So I really believe that virtual reality is at or near a crossroads, and I'm going to tell you why I think that. For the past year or so, we've asked 3,000 people every 3 months to tell us about their experience with regards to virtual reality. Some of them have heard of it, some of them haven't, some of them have tried it in various different environments, and some of them have bought it. And so we asked what we think is a weighted good sample to get a good view of what the United States consumer thinks of virtual reality. Their answers to our questions have informed this presentation. We've talked to them about a lot of different subjects, and the next few slides are going to look a little bit tough, as I said. But remember, the bottom line for a lot of these people, when we asked them if they liked using VR, they gave an unqualified thumbs up. They like the technology, they like what they see. So despite the somewhat negative things that I'm going to show in the next few slides, they overall like it, and I think that they share my opinion. It's something that we want to see work. And in that spirit, we're going to offer some potential areas that we think VR could explore as ways of advancing the technology. And when we do that, you're going to notice very quickly that a lot of our suggestions are things that are actually happening in various parts of VR that haven't happened at scale yet. And so what we're really advocating is that these get taken up in a wider context. So let's start with a kind of a market assessment. Right now, virtual reality, the penetration, trails other types of technology. We kind of track it in the same way that we track wearable technology, and wearables are out there with 11% of the market, and VR is behind that at 7%. And putting that into context, if we show maybe 17 million adult Americans as owning VR, and if 17 million people go pay for a ticket to see a movie, it's a success. At $10 a ticket, that's $170 million, and Hollywood is in ecstasy. But if 17 million buy the latest smartphone, it's a failure. So we've got to find a different way of putting it into context. And so looking at it by time, a year ago when we started the study in 2016, VR had jumped off to a great beginning, and it had 6% after just a couple of years since the release of the modern generation of equipment and applications, and everything was looking great, and there was a lot of excitement. A year later, we show ownership of VR at 7%. So it's plateaued, okay? And that isn't as good a news as everyone would like to see. So whether it's going to pick back up and look like the growth curve for tablets or even wearables, or whether it's going to have a longer period in Death Valley is open to question. And I think the answer to that question is going to be answered by some of the people that are on this panel and perhaps listening to this podcast. So we'll see how this plays for going forward. I want to note that adoption of VR has been driven by big events, you know, the mass giveaway of Google Cardboard, the highly publicized Samsung campaign, the very much publicized introduction of OR, and more recently the introduction of Sony PlayStation VR. But notice that all of these big events are hardware related. There hasn't been any kind of kick to adoption or even buzz coming from the content sector, and this is one of the issues that I hope we can address during this conversation here. It's quite different from the interactive gaming sector, where content is close enough to king to drive equipment upgrades. So the consumers that we talk to basically lead us to identify three main constraints to growth in VR: cost, content, and interface. And I want to talk about a quote I got from somebody in the sector about 6 or 7 months ago. He told me that people are getting terrible first impressions of VR due to inferior hardware and applications. And I thought he was being a little too severe. I think you know, the hardware is, I think, can be improved in a lot of different areas, and we're going to talk about that. But I don't think it's that bad, and I think the applications, again, I think they can be improved in a lot of different ways, but I don't think it's that bad. And he himself gave us, you know, ended by saying that there's plenty of hope, because thinking back to the industry experience with interactive gaming, back in the 80s, it wasn't so hot either. But we're going to talk about these three constraints to growth that we've identified. And the first is cost. And talking through the customer journey for ending up with VR, it was an eye-opener for us. It wasn't what we really expected. What we found was that people would kind of start with the starter kit, the Google Cardboard or one of the other mobile headsets, and they would quickly realize that in order to experience high-end VR, they had to upgrade from that. So they would have to go out and buy a tethered headset that would hook up to their computer. And if they weren't into interactive gaming, they'd probably have to get some kind of hand controllers, and depending on the application they bought, some other auxiliary equipment as well. So this would involve another trip down to Best Buy or a search on the internet, and the cost would be starting to mount up. Then many of them found that they'd have to upgrade their computer, buy a new computer that was significantly more expensive than the one that they were upgrading from. And if they decided not to do that, and if they had a 10-year-old kid running around the house, maybe they could get an upgraded CPU to plug in, a lot of RAM, maybe a high-end discrete graphic card, and to get their computer up to the point where it could really run VR correctly. And then they would realize that that 10-year-old kid was their son or daughter, and who really wanted a VR game console. And so at the end of the day, they're spending quite a bit of money, and they're having to take the journey zigzags. It goes back and forth, and there's false starts, and there was nobody that really charted the path to victory for the consumer in buying it. So that was kind of an eye-opener for us. That what started off as a $25 VR cardboard or some pair of goggles that they picked up with a Taco Bell purchase or you know, filling up their tank at the gas station, all of a sudden turned it into quite an expensive journey. And when we talk to them, cost counts. It's perceived as the biggest barrier to adoption by VR, and by a large margin. And this was consistent throughout each wave of the survey that we did. And it was half of the people we talked to say cost is holding them back. And I think cost will be addressed naturally over the course of time, but we've kind of presented VR as ready to go, and from a cost point of view, it isn't. And I want to note, since we're talking about obstacles to take up from VR, that there's a lot of other obstacles that are noted by double-digit percentages of people when they talk about VR. And this is of the general public, including people who own it, who have tried it, and people who don't own it and have not tried it. So some of these are perceptions and fears. Other parts of these percentages are based on experience. And if you look at these, if there was just one obstacle, like a fear of isolation or worries about motion sickness or a perception that there aren't enough good games or that effects are not realistic, if there was just one of these out there, we could probably shrug it off and move forward. But I would kind of caution everybody that the number of these perceived or real obstacles to take up a VR is troubling. And what will be a recurring theme throughout this is that I don't think that these potential or real obstacles have been addressed by the industry as a whole, that nobody's saying, hey, you know, people don't get sick, you know, or, you know, if the effects really are realistic, or that 30 titles a month are being released for VR, and you can actually go out and get them, and they're good right now. So let's talk about content a little bit. The consumers that we talk to think that gaming is going to drive VR, probably based on the history of interactive gaming, and it's certainly something that's echoed throughout the VR industry. A lot of people think gaming is going to drive it. Now, consumers express lively interest in other potential applications ranging from health and fitness to social media to training and simulation, but they think that gaming is going to be king. And sadly, for those who buy VR, they're not rushing out and loading up on games. You know, a quarter of the VR owners that we talk to don't own any games, and around 2/3 own 3 or less. So I think that this is an issue that needs to be addressed. And so, partly because of this, usage of VR is a lot lower than I think everybody wants to recognize. Only a quarter use it daily, and that rises to 36% for once a week. But more than 1/3 of VR owners use their rig once a month or less frequently. Okay. Now this tracks very closely with information we get about wearables technology, which I find very interesting, and I think it's for some of the same reasons. You know, there isn't enough to do on it to keep it, you know, out of the closet and on your lap or on your head. Which leads to kind of a chicken and egg situation, which has been talked about in the industry for at least a year that I know of, and probably a lot longer. The consumer is saying, why would I spend $1,000 for VR equipment when there aren't any compelling applications, or I can't find them, or I have to do a lot of different things to get them? The application developers on the other side are saying, well, why would I spend tens of millions of dollars developing top-end applications for such a small consumer base? And the hardware sector is kind of stuck in the middle, pushing a string and not knowing where it's going to go. Which brings us to our first series of questions. And I'm not going to talk too much about cost, because I think cost kind of sorts itself out over time with regular market forces. But let's talk a little bit about content instead, but starting with, do these numbers feel right to you? I've just gone through about 5 or 6 or 7 slides giving somewhat discouraging numbers. Do you guys agree with the broad trends of these numbers, or do you have internal figures that say, hey, this guy is talking through his hat? Lisa, what do you think?
No, Tom. I mean, I think in general, this was not unexpected. For those of us who have been close to the market, we've been saying for quite some time that the fall of 2017 was going to surface what everyone would term as the gap of disappointment. And this is because of, I think, a lot of, press and other buzz-building activities around the emergence of the technology, as technology companies rush to be the one to bring the next big thing to market. But I think the contrast between on your last slide about the gap the market opportunity for developers is something that has to be addressed, because we do feel, if you take a look at the days of when HDTV started to come out, I mean, nobody has the qualms to go buy a 100-inch, television for $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 sometimes, depending on what you are from an enthusiast perspective. But the thing about that is that the content is there to support the purchase. So I have a general sense that cost is not really an issue. It's just that they can't justify the cost for what they get in the experience. So if the experiences were there, then we'd be having a different sort of discussion. So I think the key thing is going to be to continue to expose the experiences that are available and set the bar to such that it addresses a lot of those concerns that people have about getting sick, et cetera, because as you well know, there's some amazing experiences out there. It's a matter of being able to get the right people exposed to them so that they understand that it's the time to move forward to deliver more of them.
Well, thanks for that. Jeremy, do you have anything to chime in with?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I would say, well, a couple things. First off, like $1,000 to build out a VR system like this is actually quite low. I mean, you need much more to build out a fully working Oculus rig with hand controllers and all of that. You're after video cards and computers, you're looking at $3,000, $4,000. But I'm going to slightly disagree with Lisa a little bit, but it's partially because, I mean, if you know Merge, everything we do is focused on mobile. So when we see that, your number of, 79% or something like that of people that are adopting smartphones and things like that, those are all exciting for us because everything we build is for mobile. And that's part of why we've decided to address mobile so much, is because everyone already has those devices in their pockets. I do think in the near future, though, I mean, these crazy graphics cards and high, expensive rigs aren't going to be as necessary. I mean, you're going to be able to either, real-time render this stuff in the cloud, stream it to your phone, and do all kinds of pretty powerful things on mobile. And so that's why we're excited about mobile. But overall, yeah, at least those numbers are not surprising to me either.
And what do you think?
Yeah, I think I would echo a lot of Lisa's sentiment here, in that there was an expectation, I think, for us, certainly as a venture-backed company, that this would be a long road. Without speaking towards whether we're in the trough of disappointment or not, I think what we're very excited by, at least in the early days that we've seen in terms of adoption data for raw data and the reaction that we've been getting from consumers and press on Sprint Vector, is that there's a very avid fan base, or I don't know if fan base is the right term for it, but the early adopter crowd is really enthusiastic. One of the things, and speaking to the slide that you have up right now, one of the challenges I think that the VR industry has is a relative dearth of super high quality content. We'd of course consider ourselves among that top echelon of people who are contributing it, but we'd certainly love to see more premium content investment into the VR sector. And we're sort of getting to a place where I think more and more large IP owners are paying attention to VR as an opportunity, which I think is an exciting development.
Great. Lisa, do you have something to add?
I did want to make one comment relative to people's interest in what they'd like to do with VR. And I think Tom's research is on the general population more broadly. Our research has shown that in the population of VR familiar people, those are people that have been exposed to the technology in one way, shape, or form, their actual top desire isn't gaming, which may be something that is reflected then in the post-purchase numbers that you show, Tom. And the number one thing that we found that people are asking to do in the VR familiar is that they really want travel experiences. And so those travel experiences don't necessarily need to be to real places, or outer space, or, back in time. They can also be to fantasy places that are, made up of destinations that are created in the minds of some of the amazing, creators that we see coming to the market. So I wanted to just make that comment because I think there's a general assumption in the minds of financial analysts and many others that it's going to be the gaming content that is going to actually be the success for VR. And I would counter where gaming, as Ben had said, is really they're pushing the gamers are pushing the envelope. They have the highest expectations on what these experiences can be, and quite frankly, a lot of the work that's being done in broader VR is based on the gaming engines, and you know, we're very familiar with those engines as we work with them every day. But I think I wanted to just highlight that because as people get more familiar with the technologies, I think their expectations change, and it's important for us to be able to continue to bring great content to them to keep their interest and create that more repetitive consumption that I think everyone's expecting.
Well, our research actually supports what you just said. Again, when we talk to people about what they like, it was a different story to what they expected to be the winner. They expect gaming to drive the industry, as you just said. But when we asked them what they were hoping that they would find out there in the marketplace, it was wide-ranging, and it did include travel, but also education, training and simulations, social media, a lot of different things. And to be perfectly honest, the number 2 activity all through the survey kind of surprised us. It was adult entertainment. They expected that to be something that was going to be very relevant to the industry going forward. So let's move to the second question here. Does the panel think that the first major content success, and I mean like a AAA title that really drives equipment purchases and a lot of buzz, is that going to be a VR original, or is it going to migrate from something else? Is it going to be a Star Wars or Star Trek or Batman Arkham, or is it going to be something that we develop within our own studios based on a knowledge of what the capabilities of VR are? And with that, Ben, I think I should start with you on that one.
Yeah, sure. I think history, when you look at mobile phone IP development, and then before that console and PC, history would indicate that it's going to be original content. When you look at the top games ever on iOS, you'll find titles like Temple Run and Fruit Ninja and Angry Birds, and none of which were relevant before the mobile platform was invented. And you could say the same things about the console industry as well, with all the major IP that's now contributed to the overall zeitgeist of entertainment. So I think my bias is to that, but as I was saying before in the answer to the previous question, we're at an interesting time where there is a lot of interest in VR from major stakeholders who own lots of great IP, and so. Given that kind of high-level strategic variable, it's an open question, and I wouldn't be surprised if it was a Star Wars or some other huge or Jurassic World or something like that, where there's a lot of interest from the film sector or the television sector into driving people into a platform where you can really do a lot of storytelling. One of the, quite universally, I would say, for every studio that we talk to, they indicate that the filmmakers who make their films and the TV shows and the showrunners almost universally want to have some kind of a story being told in VR, and that includes traveling to a fantasy land or traveling to a particular place and going back to the future literally in VR in some sense. And so there's no shortage of interest from the creative community in trying to erect the right storytelling mechanisms and pathways in virtual reality. But I do think it's safe to say that we're in the very, very earliest days here. And so I think it behooves us to have a little patience as the creative community understands all the powers that VR really has to really articulate what they want to do.
Great, great. Jeremy, what do you think?
In general, I'd say I completely agree with what Ben said there. I mean, looking at if history is any indication, a lot of the original stuff is really what's going to. I think a lot of it has to do with if you look at people trying to apply certain IP to new platforms. It's just inherently that IP or those things are going to have constraints that didn't take into account the capabilities of those platforms. And I think that's a big part of it. Kind of going back to your stuck in the middle slide that you had up a little bit earlier, I wonder how much that's also a reason that original content a lot of times will move forward faster or be more interesting and more heavily adopted is because they don't have those constraints, and they're not waiting on some sort of, they're not stuck in the middle, you know, they can afford to take those risks too. But yeah, in general, we're, you know, for a lot of our platforms, if you look at our Cube, for example, you know, we're licensing different IPs that we think will be successful. If you look at things like Pokemon Go, IP, of course, can be successful when applied correctly, but a lot of times I think it's just, there's so many constraints around that IP and trying to make it fit into a new technology and a new platform. Just a lot of times we'll miss the mark, whereas creatively with something original, you can really use the best of the technology and tell the best story and all of that stuff. So,
okay, makes sense. Lisa, what do you think?
I completely agree with what Ben was saying. The one thing, though, I think we have to avoid is the temptation of trying to find the one ring to rule them all. And that is, you know, we are pretty simplistic as humans. We just want to do the one thing that's going to make the biggest impact, or just know what the one big bet is. But I think this is going to be one of those things where the water is going to boil, you know, slowly and become a roar when we least expect it. And I think it's going to be the culmination of a lot of different successes. So, you know, that's kind of my point of view. If we take a look at, you know, from a consumer point of view, this question seems extremely relevant because, you know, we see the consumer market and people rushing to, you know, consume all of the components in this, you know, very interesting ecosystem, you know, kind of as being, you know, Christmas come early, right? But in truth, I think it's going to be the aggregation of everyone's efforts, both from a business-to-business perspective, you know, businesses starting to do, you know, business with consumers. That in and of itself, a compelling use case could be a significant draw, and you know, obviously mobile will be very strong in that space. But you know, in general, I agree with you, Ben. But I do think that we need to continue to make a lot of bets here, and it won't be just one thing that will put us over the top.
Cool. That kind of segues right into the third question here, and kind of to rephrase it, do organizations like Merge VR and Servios and Intel, do you have a model that that says, well, let's do it the way these guys did it in the past, with a few modifications, and if we do what they did, that'll lead us to victory or the promised land or something like that? Is there a kind of a game plan for you guys that you think will replicate or draw from past experiences? And Jeremy, you want to kick that off?
Yeah. Can you explain that question a little bit more thoroughly? That's a big question.
Maybe I'll go back to what was written on the slide. To what extent is this a repeat of the PC gaming industry experience? And if so, is it good news or bad news?
Yeah, so again, there's, I guess, two ways to look at that question. A lot of this presentation was kind of formed in the sense of console-based VR or computer-based VR. We're focused completely on mobile VR. What's interesting is if you look at you know, what happened in the 80s, and to be fair, I was pretty young in the 80s, and so, but if you look at one example I think that's worth looking at is like looking at Nintendo. And I think one of the things that made Nintendo successful is they made they made access to their console. It was very cheap and inexpensive for people to be able to play their games, things like that, late in the 80s. And so I think that's part of our approach, you know, looking at what other people have done and what's been successful in the past. That's sort of been our approach with approaching mobile, is like there's a really low barrier to entry for people to experience AR, VR, merged reality on their mobile device because they all already have one. And so I guess you could say that's probably one way we're looking at it. As far as the console and computer-based VR stuff is concerned, I'll let my co-panelists talk about that.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. Ben, what do you think?
We take analogs from a number of historical examples. Certainly, we are inspired by you know, what John Carmack was able to accomplish in the 80s with you know, video games and Doom, and you know, we've tracked, and we're still big. We have so much respect for what they're doing at Oculus because, you know, so much of what they're doing is evangelizing not only for their firm and their products, but also for the industry in total. And so I think there's a lot of DNA there, certainly that we would we would want to emulate. Another industry that we happen to take a look at and draw a lot of inspiration from also actually is in the movie business. Personally, my background is in the traditional entertainment sector, not in interactive games. And I think there's a lot of learnings to be had around how movie studios were the patrons of movie theaters at the beginning, until there was some antitrust legislation that forced them to disconnect from that. And I do think location-based entertainment, given the constraints around room scale VR and on the premium end, apart from what Merge VR is doing on the mobile side, is really relevant here, given the room scale tracking that you need often outside in, and even when you have inside out, you still have a space requirement. So there's a lot around location-based entertainment that we learn from that the traditional movie business has done really well, and I think lastly, just overall with internet technology and understanding how it is that people interact with media now, given social media is such a pervasive part of how much time we spend on our phones and on our PCs, and understanding how to really market and contextualize content to consumers. That's something that the interactive business and entertainment business broadly has gotten very good at. I don't remember the last time I actually saw a movie trailer on TV. I mean, so much of that now happens in the the video players on the internet across the web. So there's a lot around that in particular we draw inspiration from, and the biggest challenge there is, as I think we all know if we're all fans of VR, it's really hard to contextualize what a VR experience is if you're not putting a headset onto the person that you're trying to convince. And I think we've seen Samsung and others try a few things around showing expressions of people in VR being delighted and that sort of thing. And that delight is certainly a pretty universal sort of takeaway from the experience. But it doesn't speak to a lot of the challenges that you articulated earlier on in this presentation around nausea, around some of the other behavioral hurdles that people would otherwise have to cross to become VR enthusiasts. And so I think a lot of these challenges, we draw from pretty disparate sources, but there is a lot to learn. But we also have to understand that VR is such a different technology that there's not one single analog that's going to dictate the path for any one of us stakeholders in the overall value chain.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Lisa.
Well, and I think to that point, VR is an experience. And it is a spectrum of experiences. It's not a case of, when we talk about VR versus AR versus MR, I don't think it's a case of 7, 8, 9, right, where one is better or than the other. They're just different for different reasons. And so when we take a look at the growth in gaming and, in PC gaming, as you have on the screen there, I mean, I think we do take a lot of signals from that, because if you think about even esports and where it was, it's taken 13 years to get to where it is right now. It was not an overnight success. But it was built from the community within, and it was hugely responsible for introducing and growing that market. And where was the recommendations coming from? From family and friends. Your friends are going to come over and they want a game, right? They may see you gaming, then they want to get in on the action. I mean, I think that interactivity, that social component, that introduction of the technology by family and friends is going to be the way this is going to grow, which is where I think we're going to talk a little bit about location in the future. But having that safe space where someone introduces you to something new, I think is going to be hugely important for this technology. But I do think, while we still think of this as a purview of a head-mounted display or a specific piece of technology, we're going to be missing the bigger picture, and that's where I think we have to be very careful about taking signals from other spaces. I think that's good information, but the past does not always tell the future.
Good. Okay, we're going to have to move on a little bit quickly here because we're having too much fun. Let's talk a little bit about haptic interfaces. And when I worked in VR 15 years ago, we were able to put together like some kind of headset that worked. This was in Turin, Italy, and our big problem, the one that basically just led us to throw up our hands in disgust, was haptic interfaces. We were working on things like gloves and foot mice and other weird, hamster wheels for people to walk on. And my impression is that the haptics and controllers of today are not ready for prime time. And I really hope you guys can point me to examples and say, you're wrong, Tom. There is really good haptic interfaces out there. You just have to look harder. When we ask consumers, though, a quarter of them say they need a hand controller. Again, you know, not everybody's coming from the gaming environment, so that the controllers don't come along. 20%, almost 20%, say they need wands, swords, or sabers, and 15% say they need to find some way to mark out a territory to experience VR. And not only are these significant percentages, but the overall impression that consumers give us is that they have to buy a ton of stuff. That you buy some kind of device for one application, and then you got to buy another one for a different application. And these are issues that I don't think, again, are being addressed outside of the, you know, each haptic interface manufacturer will say that this is good for this application, all right, and use this for that. Well, you don't have like a Logitech that says, okay, here's the kit, here's everything you need to work with VR. And I think that there's a place for somebody to say, okay, here it is, and this is the end point. So I want to talk a little bit about that, and my first question is, am I being too tough on them? Or, you know, are there exciting developments that you see in these terms? Ben, do you want to lead that off?
Yeah, I think we're really focused on the existing controller, you know, schemes that are out there right now. I think Oculus's controller is a tremendous controller in that it really does. I'm talking about the touch controller, of course. It really does emulate what a hand will do with a certain grip, and with particularly your index finger and the traditional game controllers that you navigate with your thumbs. And I think they've done a really good job around that. We've entertained discussions with probably dozens of different kind of haptic manufacturers, but the challenge that candidly we've always seen is, you know, despite what, you know, the slide that you just put up there with people being interested in these things, what kind of adoption is really going to occur, and what kind of fragmentation in the marketplace happens when that occurs. And, you know, we've seen now Samsung and Daydream with Google and others have these kinds of controllers still on the 3DOF side for mobile. But as more of these get introduced in the market, the hope is that there's not necessarily a wide spectrum of different kinds, but more a single standard that people can agree upon that is pretty universally applicable. So that's the expectation that I have for us as an industry going forward over the next 24 or 36 months, to try to draw a little bit of normalcy, if you will, or standardization around the kinds of controllers and haptic feedback that occurs. And I don't want to spend too much time on the full spectrum of, you know, the different vests and you know, the foot tracking devices that are out there. But there's no shortage of innovation that's happening around that, primarily financed, you know, by the VC community.
Okay, that's good to hear. In the interest of time, I'll move on to the next question, unless Jeremy or Lisa, unless you want to chime in here.
I would just say real quick about this question. There's a conference called SIGGRAPH that most of you are probably familiar with, and there's a venue there called the Emerging Technologies Group, and I actually ran it last year, and they're doing a lot of, there's universities and companies from all over the place doing a lot of really cool things in haptics, but to Ben's point, I mean, he's mostly right about until there's some sort of standards, then yeah, you're going to need different things for different stuff depending on what people put out there, right? But there's no shortage of innovation in this space at all.
Innovation is one thing, support from the rest of the community is something else. How tough is it for interface manufacturers to deal with a basically unformed and heterogeneous environment? Lisa, do you want to talk to that?
Yeah, I think it is tough for them. As you know, Intel's been very focused on standards over the years, you know, leading many of the organizations, and we're in a ton of the ones in this space as well. But I do think we have to be a little bit, we have to step back a little bit and really understand that in those, where there is short-term pain for the consumers, you know, there is a long-term gain in innovation by not rushing sometimes too quickly to stifle innovation in the names of, you know, again, the one ring to rule them all standards. So it's going to be very interesting to watch. I think it is. There will be a lot of manufacturers that will die on the hill of trying to make, accessories for this market. But I do think that it is also important for that innovation to happen. That's where the strength of tech has always been, and in supporting and being interested in many, many different ways to get things done. And again, if I might just, say what I said in the last, comment, which is the past should not tell the future. A lot of times users are asking for things because it's based on what they already know. And what the job of innovators and technologists to do is to push those boundaries and change people's perceptions. So I think that's going to be the key thing, moving forward.
Okay. Again, in the interest of time, unless somebody else has something to say, I'm going to move on to the next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about solutions, all right? The consumers we talked to highlighted some issues, and I think they're real issues, but they also pointed the way to something that could be potential solutions. Now, bear in mind that these are coming from outside the industry. I worked in VR 15 years ago, haven't been back there since. I'm a market researcher. The people I talk to are market researchers. I do talk to people in the industry, but these ideas didn't come from them. So some of these ideas are going to sound naive or even stupid, but occasionally you get something from outside the industry that can point out the obvious and maybe spark some interest. And I'll also point out, as I said earlier, that a lot of the ideas that I'm going to talk about here actually already exist, but not to scale. And I think, what I'm actually calling for is more support from across the industry for some of the ideas that I'm going to mention here. So just basically for haptics, Lisa was talking about one ring to rule them all, so we have to have another Fellowship of the Ring reference in here. Andy Serkis put a bunch of motion capture sensors on him in 2000, and graphic artists turned him into Gollum, or Smeagol if you want to get technical. And ever since then, there's been a lot of work in haptic interfaces outside the VR industry. And one of the big examples is wearables, which is a parallel technology that is kind of at the same level of valley of disenchantment as VR is right now. And when I say wearables, everybody thinks of fitness wearables. But actually there are fashion accessories, there's jewelry, there's clothing out there that uses, that can effectively serve as motion capture sensors, and they could be used for VR. And I'm just wondering, I don't see the industry alliances between VR companies and wearable manufacturers, and I just kind of wonder why. And I think it's something that, could at least be looked at in terms of potential. Then moving into applications, I know that there are niche applications for niche audiences, but I think that it could be pushed and it could be used as a proving ground for things that we all hope will become general consumer applications in the world. And I'm specifically, it seems to me that VR, and this is just kind of my own brain wandering off on its own track, it's as much about what it excludes as what it shows. It excludes the outside world, and that is a benefit to niche audiences. People in retirement homes, people in hospitals, people in prisons, people that are jumping up and down on a Stairmaster, they kind of want to shut the world out. And applications developed for these specific niche audiences, they can be thinner in terms of content, but have more longevity in terms of, like, you stop it every time you get off the running machine, and you start it again the next time you get on it. And I really think that this is another area that could be developed further, again, if it had the support from not just the app developer, but other people instead. This guy that's on this machine up here, he's exercising, and he looks like he's having a great old time. But does everybody need to have a specific exercise machine for their application? I don't think so. Then one area of big success that, again, I think needs industry support from across the whole VR spectrum is location-based applications. People may not be willing to buy a lot of VR right now, but they're happy to rent it or use it for free. And there's a lot of it going on with the Void, and there's a VR park in Beijing, and you can use a virtual reality roller coaster ride at some theme parks. You can go through a home or an apartment or the next car you're going to buy using VR. You can play laser tag and all of that, or VR versions of it, or see the backstory of any location that you're actually visiting in real time at a museum or just historical buildings. And the point of all of this is that getting people used to a technology has been used in the past to great success to drive development of a consumer base for it. And although there's a lot of individual successes out there, I don't see Samsung talking about how to use it with Marriott hotels, and I don't see Oculus Rift talking about how you can tour a museum virtually and things like that. So I just think that there's a lot of individual use cases out there that are not being exploited by the entire spectrum of VR participants. So let's talk a little bit, and we may end up having to finish here. I'll let Richard be the judge of that. How important is location-based VR as the consumer market develops, and where are the main opportunities in this area now? And it's only natural that we turn to Ben for this.
Thanks, Richard. I would say, just from Servio's perspective, location-based VR is a really interesting growing opportunity that I think still a lot of developers and hardware manufacturers are still waking up to. I think we've talked a lot about some of the constraints around VR today, mostly focused around cost, and that I think alludes mostly, to the high end of the VR sector. A Google Cardboard costs nothing sometimes. You can get a free one if you're a New York Times subscriber, among other things. But buying an entire rig, as Jeremy pointed out, can cost thousands of dollars, and that's just not a entry price for most consumers unless you're a well-heeled early adopter. And so, as one of the developers for high-end VR, we have found that a very effective strategy of driving consumers into raw data, Sprint Vector, and the other high-end titles that are out there, or at least titles that are catered to the high-end market, is pointing them to location-based centers. One of our more prominent partners is IMAX VR. They have 3 locations already around the world, and they host both raw data and Sprint Vector in their locations. And we estimate that we've entertained 5 to 7 times more consumers in location-based centers than in the retail market. And so we think that this is a fantastic entry point for many consumers into 6DoF VR, and this is an area that Servios will continue to invest in the near and medium terms.
Okay, that's great. Lisa, I want to turn to you. Again, along with all of these other ideas, I'm talking about getting support from the rest of the VR community. What is Intel doing to help location-based entertainment introduce VR to the rest of the world?
Yeah, we think this is hugely important, and that's because our research shows, as I might have mentioned, that people are more likely to want to acquire VR for themselves when they've been introduced to it from family and friends. And I think this is just, to Ben's point about in the retail environment, people feel, somewhat vulnerable when trying those experiences. But if you're at a location-based experience, maybe you're at an arcade or at a museum or at a mall or wherever that might be, you're usually with family and friends the majority of time, and I think that is like a huge barrier that gets removed in that scenario. So we feel that location-based is extremely important. You mentioned the museum experience as well. We also feel that's very important. We'll be making investments in both those areas in 2018, along with the other things that we're doing. If you think about the number of artifacts that are in museums today that no one will ever see, and the cost of building out physical, space where there really is none in large cities, and the drive from the education market to expose people, and the rate that a lot of historical places are being destroyed in the world today. So there's a lot to do, but we feel that location is a huge part of how people will first encounter the technology, and that is certainly among our top priorities for the coming year.
Cool, that's good to hear. I know you do a lot of work for interactive gaming and supporting conferences and stuff like that. It'd be lovely to see that for VR as well. Jeremy, what do you think?
Well, I mean, the truth is location-based entertainment is one of the few and only places that anyone's making money in VR. So. Okay.
Now, we hear about B2B sales in AR all the time, and augmented reality looks like it's going to take the business world by storm almost any day now. What about for VR and immersive tech? Do you think that the B2B applications of virtual reality are growing right now? Do you think it's something that can support the technology providers and application developers until the consumer wakes up and starts grabbing it off the shelves? Jeremy, what do you think?
Yeah, one interesting thing to mention here is, when we're looking at we launched our Cube in August, and a couple months before that, we opened up development on it to anyone that wanted to build anything. And so within probably about a month, we had, I don't know, 700 or 800 developers sending in license requests asking to build something. And as part of that, they had to describe roughly what they were building. And really, it was for us to just categorize these licenses. And interestingly enough, as a kids product, we expected most of these to be games and sort of maybe edutainment style things, but I would say half of them were completely enterprise applications, looking at augmented and virtual reality, using the Cube to do visualizations and to do all kinds of manufacturing visualization, all kinds of interesting things like that. So yeah, we're seeing a lot of interest there that we probably didn't expect.
Okay, that's
a lot of what we're focusing on right now is really this idea of this merged reality and this augmented reality space, and really it's all kind of the same thing. People are wearing a VR headset, but ultimately we're using computer vision to track their positions. We're using computer vision to track objects and things like that. So whether it's AR or VR, all seems a little semantical to us.
Okay. I'm going to have to, we're timing out here, so I am going to just move to my thank you slide because it has my email in case people have other questions, which is a pity. There's a lot of stuff that I really, really wanted to talk about. But I want to thank all the members of the panel for joining in and enlightening me as well as I hope the audience. I learned a lot from listening to you guys talk, and I want to thank VR Intelligence for sponsoring this and making it possible. And with that, I'm going to turn this back over to Richard. Richard.
Thank you very much, Tom. Thank you very much indeed. That was brilliant. And thank you, obviously, to all of our panelists, Jeremy, Lisa, and Ben. It's been a real pleasure and very insightful to hear from you all. So we will be sending round the recording of this webinar afterwards, along with a link to download Tom's slides. So do keep an eye out for that. And once again, if you'd like to hear more about the business of VR and AR, you can join us on December 7th and 8th in San Francisco for VRX 2017, where we'll be bringing together senior level business leaders in gaming, film, enterprise, TV, healthcare, education, and much more. So if you'd like to learn more about that, go to vr-intelligence.com/VRX. And thanks again for joining us, and we will be in touch with you again soon.